Hello and welcome to the Exit Readiness Podcast. My name is Pat Ennis of Ennis Legacy Partners. I'm here with my trusted co-host Walter Dial, who is a partner at Gelman, Rosenberg & Friedman. CPA is located in Bethesda, Maryland. One of the goals for this podcast is to provide information that can help a business owner minimize risk that will in turn help to increase the value of their business. And today we're going to talk about one of the biggest areas of risk an owner faces these days. Research conducted by the National Cybersecurity Alliance found that, number one, almost 50% of small businesses have experienced a cyber attack. Number two, more than 70% of attacks target small businesses, and as much as 60% of hacked small and medium-sized businesses go out of business after 6 months. Today we're going to talk about privacy and cybersecurity, the differences between the two, why business owners should care about privacy and cybersecurity, what the top risks are, what steps owners can take to minimize risk, and more. So, Walter, first question for you to get started here. As a certified valuation specialist, one of the many things that you are, what are your thoughts about the future and how cyber and privacy will factor into the valuation of a business?
That's an interesting question, Pat. You know, when we value a business, one of the things we do is evaluate the various risk factors that could impact the profitability of the company. And I would say, 10 years ago, cybersecurity would not even have entered into the picture there. But nowadays, you look at a company like Equifax, which had a major breach, and I think their stock plummeted like 20% in a couple of days. So the whole issue of cybersecurity is just one additional risk factor that's going to come into play in determining the value of a company.
Yeah, well, it's great today. We got a guest, attorney Dave Greber of Offit Kurman, and he's based in Frederick, Maryland. Offit Kurman has offices all over the D.C. area and in other states as well, I think. And he's going to help us and listeners he's going to help the the listeners today work on increasing the value of their business by minimizing the risk involved with cyber and privacy. Dave has both an MBA and JD from Northwestern and his BA from the University of Virginia, so Dave's a really smart guy. He's been in practice for a lot of years. His practice areas include business and intellectual property, privacy and data protection, and estate planning. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you, Pat.
Dave, to get started, maybe you could take a minute or two and just describe your practice in a little bit more detail.
I represent businesses, small, emerging, and medium-sized businesses in a variety of contexts, some of which you named, which include contract negotiation, purchases and sales of businesses, advising on data security and privacy-related matters. Businesses more and more are looking to use the internet as a means of making contact with customers and prospective customers. And with the increase in privacy and data security regulation, there is a growing need for businesses to take stock of their obligations and to address them at all phases of their business life cycle.
Yeah, well, we're seeing that more and more, of course, in the work that we're doing. And so, Dave, it's great to have you here. Again, thanks for taking the time. Walter, I think, has got the first question for you today.
Thanks, Pat. So, Dave, unlike you, I'm not a smart guy when it comes to privacy and data security. So let me ask you a really basic question. What's the difference between privacy and data security? And I assume they somehow relate to each other.
They do. I don't know if I can live up to the billing of Pat's introduction, so I'll just say that right off the bat. But no, privacy and data security are basically two sides of the same coin. And the coin itself is the way in which businesses protect confidential information, particularly personally identifiable information that they obtain from their customers and their prospective customers who visit them on their website. Cybersecurity or data security is focused on protecting information from bad actors who would attempt to infiltrate the company's database through unlawful means from the outside. typically by hacking, for example. Whereas data privacy has to do with how the business makes choices itself in the way it uses information that it receives from its customers, how it uses, discloses, stores, and destroys that information. So the one is kind of like protecting against burglars, and the other is protecting against improper use of data by the company's own employees.
Okay, great. That helps me to understand that better. And I guess companies need to care about this, not just the catastrophic situations you hear about in the media, but there can be a lot of other issues when it comes to this whole area, right?
Yeah, the reasons why a company should care about cybersecurity and data privacy are not only that there may be regulatory enforcement actions taken against them by regulators like the Federal Trade Commission. So there's that. There's the possibility of customers taking legal action in court. There's that. But beyond that, there's also the reputational risk that goes with being a company that has experienced a data breach. Customers become concerned whether or not they can safely deal with a company, and potentially would shy away from a company that has been the victim of a breach. So there are reputational and regulatory and legal reasons why companies should care.
Yeah, those are great points.
Dave, what are the top cyber risk for companies?
I think that if I were to name one, I'll name more than one, but if I were to name one, I think it might be phishing. Phishing is a technique used by bad actors to send emails to members of your company that claim to be something they're not. They often ask the recipient to open an attachment, and when the attachment is opened, malware is installed on the person's computer who opened it. So, for example, I know of an instance in which a company was a victim of a phishing attack where one of its many employees opened an email that enabled the bad actor to gain access to the email account of the employee. The bad actor then went in and into the email account of the employee and created a forwarding rule that caused all of the employee's incoming email to be forwarded to the bad actor. So the bad actor then sat in wait, looking for information that they could use to perpetrate financial crimes from that point forward. That's an example. The problem with these phishing attacks is that you often don't know that they've occurred. And it can be weeks or days or weeks or months even before something happens. And meanwhile, you're vulnerable. So definitely one of the biggest cyber risks. There are also risks of sort of brute force hacking where people get into your database through your right into your server because you don't have a firewall or because you don't have an adequate one or whatnot, and gain access directly that way. And then there could be ransomware attacks where companies actually take over your database and threaten to destroy it if you don't pay them money and hold your data hostage. But I think if I were to pick one, it would be the phishing attack.
Yeah, follow-up question to that. So, Dave, is that primarily then for the owner of the business or owners of the business, is that primarily a training issue with staff where they have to be very intentional and probably, I guess, regularly intentional about training staff as to how to recognize this phishing attack going on?
I think it is dominantly a training issue, yes. So cybersecurity measures can be broken down into more or less three areas. Physical, technical, and administrative protections. So, and under the administrative protections is the whole issue of education. And so there ought to be, it's prudent for there to be periodic educational opportunities that employers give to their employees, or requirements that they give to their employees to remind them to look out for and never to open an attachment that is coming from someone they don't specifically know, and to immediately report the fact that they've done so, which can be difficult for an employee, so that the company can then have its computer consultants come in and do a search for malware and to do further investigation to see if any harm has been done.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know at our firm, about every quarter we get a different training on just the area you're talking about, and then throughout the year, the IT department will send little fake emails and see who clicks on them. And of course, I clicked on the last one.
Yes.
Of course you did.
So I have to go back for some more training. So are there like guidelines available to companies to help them evaluate their cyber risks?
There are quite a few different sources of guidelines. I think that one of the more practical sources would be to go to the Federal Trade Commission website and to search privacy and data security. There are a whole host of opportunities there, documents, videos, and all kinds of different guidelines that companies can use to improve their protection on both the cybersecurity and the privacy fronts. I mean, in the accounting realm, as you know, Walter, there are generally accepted security principles under GAAP, where CPAs can actually come in and help to evaluate security. And privacy security tends to be the focus there more than data privacy, but still. But I would start with the FTC website. If I were to name one other source, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which is found at www.nist.gov, has been engaging in a very broad-based, countrywide examination of cybersecurity issues and published a framework, which is basically a checklist of how to think through these issues, beginning in 2014. And that work is ongoing, but that involved a collaboration of government and industry, broadly speaking, throughout the United States. The NIST framework is, in certain areas, becoming an industry standard, but also a regulatory standard for what constitutes reasonable measures to protect privacy and data security.
So, Dave, are there cybersecurity measures that companies, businesses are required to take, and if so, who requires them, and what are they?
The United States regulates privacy and data security in a patchwork, which means of regulations, which means this can get to be a complicated answer. There are federal regulations that are industry specific. So, for example, the financial industry has different legislation and regulations that pertain to it. If you are marketing intentionally to children, then there's a specific set of guidelines related to that on the federal level, and others like that. So there's a patchwork on the federal level. On the state level, the states are jumping in and creating their own regulations as well. So there are numerous sources of potential obligation. But so in terms of what's a small business to do with that, because it can feel crushing to contemplate all of these different sources of regulation. I think that the best way to do it is to begin to understand the general principles of cybersecurity and privacy, and then do what is reasonable under your circumstances based on the information that you use. So at the very least, that means sitting down and trying to evaluate what kinds of information you gather and how you use, share, store, and destroy that information. And then, based on your economic means, to take measures that are within your grasp financially. So I think that the regulators and judges have the least patience for companies who don't take steps that didn't cost that much money, but only would have cost some time to sit down and implement. For example, I think at this point that the implementation of a firewall would be considered a requirement of reasonable data security for any company. Firewalls come in very inexpensive implementations, and basically any company that's in business would be expected to have a firewall. Data encryption is something that is not expensive and can be implemented just with some administrative decisions. Password protection and rules for strong passwords and periodic changes of passwords doesn't cost much money, but you have to sit down and try to be intentional and try to take some steps rather than just waiting to see what happens, because waiting to see what happens and not trying is a little bit like a shop owner just leaving its door not only unlocked but wide open at night, and that's not reasonable.
Well, could a business owner at this point be audited by either a federal or state agency regarding compliance with these measures?
Yes. Often that happens after something has happened, after something bad has happened. So if there's been a data breach and regulators become aware that it's happened, the Federal Trade Commission, for example, has numerous enforcement actions that it has brought over the years under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, which is a statute that goes back to like 1945 and says that it's unlawful to engage in unfair or deceptive trade practices. That's all it says. But the FTC has taken that statutory language to enforce privacy and data security regulations. So they consider it unfair for companies to have inadequate data security, cybersecurity measures in place. And they consider it deceptive under the FTC Act for a company to do something different than the company said it was doing in its online privacy notice or privacy policy. So when something bad happens, particularly if it's to a large entity, the FTC can come in and evaluate what the data security and privacy measures were, and then impose ongoing regulatory requirements on the company to comply with the terms of the enforcement action. So it can get quite onerous, but usually it's after the fact, not before trouble hits.
So Dave, something you just mentioned, websites. So websites seem to always have like a privacy notice or a privacy policy posted on them. So those actually have to be given a lot of thought, and they're not just like boilerplate, I guess.
No, they're not. And I think it's a danger to consider them boilerplate. The reason that you can't consider them boilerplate is that you're supposed to tell your visitors what you're actually doing. So with the data that you gather. And if you take something that you got from another source and you just kind of change the names and stick it up on your website, if that complies with, if that happens to match what you're actually doing, it's just by pure luck, because companies handle their data and differently. And so you have to actually sit down and figure out what are you really doing, and then make the notice appropriate to what you're really doing. It's important you can get yourself in trouble also by making well-meaning statements on your privacy notice that the FTC or private litigants might then regard as a warranty. So if you say that you follow privacy and data security best practices, for example, that might be something that you feel would be a fairly risk-free thing to say. But the problem is that if you don't follow best practices or don't have a reasonable argument, you don't follow the protocols of ISO 27000 series of protocols for security, or you don't have some other objective evaluation of what best practices you follow, you can get in trouble for engaging in a deceptive trade practice, as the FTC would say. It's not only the FTC though that enforces these things. For example, in the state of Maryland, companies are obligated to implement reasonable data security processes, which include if you share the data, personally identifiable information with third parties, having contract provisions in place with those entities that obligate them to limit their use of the information to the business purposes of the engagement, and not to further disclose them to additional third parties for their own purposes.
So when I log on to a website, I mean, can I assume that there's certain legal limitations to what they can do with my information, or should I be reading that privacy policy to determine that on my own?
Theoretically, you should be reading the privacy notice to determine that on your own, because the issue of privacy is organized around the concept of consent. It's a choice and consent. So if the privacy notice advises you that the information will be used for various purposes and you click, yes, I agree, then what would otherwise be an improper use of the data, had you not consented, becomes an acceptable use of the data because you've consented. So theoretically, you should read the privacy notices and make a choice. The difficult place that puts us in is that if you sometimes you have a take it or leave it, you're in a take it or leave it position. Right. So if you read, for example, the privacy notice associated with your smart TV, there may be some things in there that would cause you to be uncomfortable. So what are you going to do? You're either going to click OK and hold your nose and hope for the best, or you have to put the TV back in the box, and take it back to Best Buy to see if there's another TV, if Vizio has a better privacy notice than Samsung. It puts us all in a difficult position.
Dave, how has the Internet of Things changed the cyber landscape?
It is creating a broader and more pervasive ability of companies to gather data about you. And so from a cybersecurity perspective, it can create security vulnerabilities, because now this data that's stored on your whatever, your thermostat, your Roomba, your automatic vacuum cleaner, those robots that vacuum, and theoretically, those things can now be hacked, and the data can now be used by third parties. It's hard to imagine all of the different ways in which the things that we now use can become slaved by bad actors. I just recently bought a car, and cars are becoming more and more subject to this Internet of Things, in that the cars become ways in which the car makers can gather data about the car users. And, as cars move toward fully autonomous driving vehicles, this is going to just be more and more the case. Our locations and our behaviors are theoretically capturable or being captured by the car manufacturers. And if that's then hacked, then our locations can be hacked and our behaviors can be hacked. Our cell phones are now gathering location data usually, so that you may notice that advertisers seem to be able to know that you've almost literally that you've walked into a store and are looking for something to buy, because the ads that are popping up on your phone are now relevant to where you're actually standing. So there are security vulnerability issues as well, and the degree to which location data is being used now becomes something that has to be considered in privacy notices. Yeah,
so it can just feel like it's inevitable, Dave, frankly, when your vacuum cleaners and your microwave ovens and everything else is gathering data, and everything can be hacked. It almost feels like I'm going to get hacked one way or the other eventually, and so why even worry about it, or why even bother trying to? What would you say to that?
I say that I sympathize with the feeling, and I feel that way myself, but I'm a little bit afraid by that conclusion. Just on the vacuum cleaners. Last summer, this automatic vacuum cleaner company, Roomba, announced that it was considering selling the data gathered by its Rumba vacuum cleaners. And that kind of hit home to me because I have two married adult daughters, both of whom have these things. And I thought, wait a minute, who is getting information, and what kind of information are they getting about my daughters and sons-in-law? And it was not a comfortable feeling. And I don't know that whatever obscure privacy notice tucked in some box or buried in some website fully prepares my kids for an appreciation that personal information about the contours of their living room or who the heck knows what else are now being used some way by Rumba or companies to whom Rumba sells the information. It's not comfortable to me. What can we do about it? We're not in an environment regulatory environment on the federal level where this is likely going to be handled. So, and so that'll leave it to the states. And I think states will be the new frontier for defense of privacy issues. The federal government, I don't think, is going to be in the game for a while.
And I know this is an evolving area for sure, as technology is constantly changing. But is there anything on the horizon for the next 12 months that you see as a major issue that is going to be addressed, or anything else as far as the security landscape changing over the next 12 months?
I think as far as the next 12 months are concerned, what is, or 12 or 24, is that states will more and more come into the privacy and data security regulation field, the larger states playing the largest roles, California being the largest of the large and the most influential of the states. And I think part of that is because that's just the natural development of this practice area in law, and part of it is the perception that the federal government is stepping out of regulation of this kind. There's just a general mood of deregulation on the federal level, and I think that's creating concern on the state level, and so you're going to see a flurry of state regulation, and that's going to make it that much more difficult for companies to comply with privacy and data security rules. So my advice to companies would be learn the basic, at least start here. Sit down and make an attempt to figure out how you gather information and how you protect it. Try and follow the general principles of privacy and data security to your reasonable ability based on your size and economics. And then if you're in a company that uses the kinds of information that are of particular concern to regulators, like things related to children under 13, like financial transactions, if you're in the financial area at all, like the use of credit reports, which is the area that was first regulated on the federal level, then you have to get more particularized. And you're already taking a risk by sort of following just general principles and not drilling it down, but that may be a risk you have to take from an economic point of view. But if you're in one of these folk areas, then I think you have to drill down a little bit more.
Okay, Dave, so final question, I think. What final advice would you provide for a business owner listener who's concerned about this area, cyber and privacy, and they're concerned about maximizing the value of their business? They're thinking about, I want to exit, I want to maximize the value of the business, and I'm concerned about these two different categories. What final advice might you give in regard to next steps or what advisors are they going to need to talk to and get on their team?
I would say what I would recommend that they do is that they try, if I were to put it in a word. And try would mean assign somebody in the company who is going to run point on privacy and data security. And maybe it's your IT specialist. Maybe it probably needs to be someone who's going to have management concern about it. So it's probably going to be one of your officers. I would try. The number two thing is that I would say to that person, I'd like you to read up on the FTC website a little bit to get some general guidelines, and let's sit down around a table and have a discussion about what information we use and how we can protect it and tell people how we use it. They may benefit from having a professional like someone who's in privacy and data security, like a lawyer, there are other kinds of consultants, but who can help guide them through. But try is the operative word. So try to do the things that are fully within reach without spending a lot of money that most people are doing, like firewalls, like passwords, like encryption, and then try to make it an area of continuous improvement going forward. I will tell you, as someone who does acquisition work on companies, that if your exit strategy is to sell your business and you are successful about growing your business, then and the people who are thinking about buying you have their head on straight, then they're going to send you a checklist if they know before they buy you. And some of what they are going to ask you is probably going to have to do with privacy and data security matters. You're going to want to be able to give an answer that preserves the value that you work so hard to create in the business itself. And you, from a securities law perspective, if you're offering to sell ownership interests, are going to be obligated to tell them things that are important, which includes things about cybersecurity and privacy. So try to move toward improvement of privacy and data security by using the reference materials and the sources that I've mentioned, which will cost you time but not money, and then decide whether you need to involve a professional who is going to cost you some money on an hourly basis. But start internally.
Okay. Well, Dave, I think we're going to have listeners who are going to want to try, and they're going to probably want to start that process by maybe contacting you. So can you share with the listeners, if they want to reach you, what's the best way to do that?
So you can reach me by phone at 240-772-5137 at Offit Kurman. That's OFFIT Kurman, KURMAN, the law firm in which I practice. Or you can reach me by email at D, as in David, Greber, Greber, at offitkurman.com. We are obviously on the internet, so if you Google us, you can see what our firm's website looks like and what our legal services are, but we have offices from Tyson's Corner to New York City, and can help you anywhere in that geography.
Fantastic. Well, Dave, thanks so much for being with us today. This is a hot topic, and I'm sure we're going to have you back in the future, at least once, if not regularly, because this is going to be ever-changing and a big area of concern for the type of business owner who's going to be listening to this podcast, I think. So thank you. Appreciate your time today, Dave. Walter, what do you think listeners should keep in mind as a result of this interview today with Dave?
Thanks very much, Dave. It was very, very, very informative and helpful. And I think Dave summed everything up really well with the answer to the last question. Business owners should start on their own, and there's probably a lot they can do. But if it comes to the situation where they need, for instance, we provide IT audits, and there's other professionals that do that as well. And then obviously the expertise that Dave offers may be needed, but certainly start by examining the internal procedures and your policies and kind of go from there. I think Dave did a great job of summarizing all that.
Yep. Okay, well, listeners, our goals for this podcast are simple. We want to provide information that's going to help you, the business owner, build transferable value, minimize risk, plan your exit so that you exit on your own terms and conditions. We also want to encourage you to begin planning now. And if you wait, we like to say this, if you wait until you're ready to to begin exit planning, you won't be ready, and neither will your business. So get started as soon as possible. If you found this information today to be helpful, please consider sharing the podcast on social media. Check out our services at innislp.com and Walter and his firm at grfcpa.com. Special thanks to Charlie Burney and Podcast Village for hosting us. Thank you, folks. Until next time on the Exit Readiness Podcast, this is Pat Ennis and Walter Dial signing off.